Hello, it's Soul, back with some more Shadowlands coverage. We're back on the beta, and today we're going to take a first look, an early look, a beta look at generic legendaries, and then share my impressions on whether these legendaries are even worth making, because as of this build we have like 15 of them to choose from, and 7 of those, which I'm going to talk about today, are shared among all the classes. A few minor notes about these legendary powers so far, and also another reminder that this is beta. The legendaries that have values attached to them don't scale with stats, so I presume the power of these items will scale with its item level. Once we have 2 generations of legendaries to compare, then we can know for sure. These powers also don't seem to lock to a specialization, that is, the legendary will always work regardless of role. So let's dive straight in, starting with Echo of ENR, which procs 3.5 times a minute before haste. While healing, it buffs a nearby target, increasing their damage and healing by a flat value, not a percentage, a flat value, for 20 seconds. If there are no nearby allies, it will instead debuff an enemy and increase their damage taken by you for the same flat value. This is a weird one. It's sort of like a random Blessing of Summer proc, which deals a little bit of extra damage and it does not scale. A bonus 250 damage or so doesn't seem significant, but consider the upcoming stat squish, and while this won't show up on your meters really, the long uptime and a high proc rate can prove this to be a reasonable powerful party and raid buff. Now, I wouldn't consider this to be your very first legendary. In my opinion, the healer specs have stronger legendary powers at their disposal, but it's worth considering having this as part of your toolkit thanks to the buff. The Judgment of the Arbiter is a damage proc that happens 6 times a minute before haste, and in-game this deals 500 damage. The bonus proc is really interesting though. This Judgment damage thing will also jump to one nearby ally who is also using this legendary. So here's how I'm understanding it. So it procs, an enemy is hit, and then it jumps from that enemy to an ally, damaging all enemies in its way, including, I hope, the original enemy that was hit. So if I have this legendary as a tank, and I have one other person at close range, good positioning means that my partner and I can do some pretty insane damage between both of us proccing and arcing these judgments between each other. For you math heads, think of it like this. Before haste, we have 6 procs a minute times 500 damage, and that equates to potentially 3k DPS from this proc alone. If you add just one more person to that, they add their own 3k DPS, and the damage arcs to you, meaning that's another 3k. And your procs are jumping to them, another 3k. Now imagine cutting through a tight pack of mobs. It sounds pretty crazy, but this also means that too many people might make this proc less reliable. Like, if a proc were to go off and it were to go to someone in a weird position, then it wouldn't hit as many targets. But this still can be a really fun legendary to play with. It's potentially a first legendary, if you know you have a friend or 3 who will also do the same thing, because otherwise running this alone will definitely leave you wanting. I can imagine more than a few unintended consequences before this gets nerfed. Let's move on to Norgannon Sagacity, which basically gives you the capacity, it gives you the capacity to move on cast. It just requires a bit of work. This is potentially a high value legendary for those who can easily build high stacks of Sagacity with quick or instant casts, and can use raid and dungeon encounter knowledge to max out the potential of this perk. There are probably better legendaries for your class in PvP, but being able to cast on the move could give you that small bit of distance that you need to make the difference between life and death. Cephalus's Proclamation is, well, it's mostly a PvP thing, I think. As you may already know, the PvP talent node in Shadowlands that gave you an escape button or reduced crowd control duration is no more. That's going to be folded into other things like gear, soulbind perks, and here, with a legendary. This reduces CC effects by 25%, and if this can stack with other effects like the Orc Racial Hardiness and the Soulsteel Clamp Soulbind perk for the Kyrian, that's an 80% base stun reduction. This probably isn't going to stack as well as anyone would like though, and if so, it would be a good idea, Blizzard, to clarify that this legendary and or this perk does not stack with other existing effects. Offensively, the stat increase is pretty decent at 50 some odd stats, and its use in PvP once again can't be denied. Meanwhile, in raiding, people will be fighting to get a stun or an interrupt off for their own sake, so I don't really recommend this for PvE stuff. If you PvP seriously though, this is more than likely a lock for your first legendary. The stable Phantasm Allure is a Torghast specific legendary, and one that I can say with confidence will drop from running Torghast content because, well, it's the only legendary that I naturally unlocked in the beta. Anyway, it increases the drop value of Phantasma, the stuff that lets you buy temporary buffs and extra lives in the dungeon. At the moment, this legendary is nearly worthless, because Phantasma drops at what I think is a very elevated rate. You can usually buy almost everything you want from a vendor each time you run into one. But the fact that there's a legendary based on currency generation, I'm certain that Phantasma will end up dropping at a much lower rate by the time Shadowlands goes live, or stuff from the vendor is just going to cost that much more. That means this here is going to be a low-key, overpowered legendary, because stacking anima powers and Torghast is far more valuable than anything else you can get your hands on. This is going to make for a solid secondary legendary, if and when you know that you're going to need the extra boost to survive high-level floors, but on easier floors this can be tucked away. The third eye of the Jailer is a Maw-specific legendary. No idea if this is also going to work in Torghast, but for now we'll just work with the Maw. It's really hard to quantify the value of this legendary though, because to be frank, we don't know what the purpose of the Maw is, other than a place that eventually kills us. From the reward loop, to the flow of events, to even how much this legendary increases our damage, this one is going to be near the bottom of your legendary list until we know more. That said, the Maw is a pretty rough place, and this legendary potentially adds a sort of killstreak bonus if you have decent ad control. Notice that the bonus increases your overall damage, and not just your damage against the specific mob you've been killing. Now imagine pulling a bunch of the same mobs, you kill them all to get the maximum bonus, and then you do a large pull of mobs, you line up cooldowns, and then you slam that pack with your hardest hitting ability. Or you engage a really tough elite boss with this bonus that you'll have until that elite is dead. It's not bad, but I guess there are still probably better legendaries you can invest into. Finally, we have the Vitality Sacrifice. At first glance, this has clear advantages for a tank, and with this legendary they can have more effective health on the pull for the most part. The weakness of this legendary comes from the fact that it'll only proc off of one enemy once, and as long as you haven't damaged them previously. Not to mention that your damage absorb only applies to that enemy you damaged. And this only works on elites, so whether this works on a raid boss with ads is something that you're going to encounter case by case. In many regards, this legendary ranks low on the list, but this has more practical applications when soloing Torghast, especially on high floors when you want to down elites as quickly as you can. It becomes even more valuable if the value of the absorb is dependent on something like your maximum health, because that's a stat that can be increased like tenfold in Torghast, making you extremely deadly to the toughest of what that place has to offer. And then suddenly this legendary becomes very attractive. So those are the 7 legendaries that any class can use. Obviously not all classes or specs will see this as the same, so what are you planning on making first? One of these? One of the ones that are specific to your class or spec? And do you think this reflects lessons learned from the past regarding targeted legendaries, throughput versus utility, and, all the etceteras? Share your thoughts in a comment below. Like this video if it was helpful, and subscribe for more Shadowlands coverage and all things Warcraft. We'll see you later. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay breezy.